part. So the last time I preached was way back in, was it October, I think? And I opened our series, and this is a series we've been doing on co-creation, stories of co-creation and climate justice. And I got to tell 3 versions of the big story of everything. And today I get to close the series by telling you one version of the end of the story, as told by the prophet Isaiah almost 3,000 years ago. So we're going to have Jeremy read this passage for us. And I just want to encourage you to pay close attention to the images that Isaiah uses in this beautiful ancient prophecy. So go ahead, Tuesday, and put it up on the screen.
A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of knowledge and fear of the Lord. And he will delight. Sorry, you went too fast. And he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes, or decide by what he hears with his ears, but with righteousness he will judge the needy. With justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. With the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Righteousness will be his belt, and faithfulness the sash around his waist. The wolf will live with the lamb. The leopard will lie down with the goat. The calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. The cow will feed with the bear. Their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. The infant will play near the cobra's den, and the young child will put its hand into the viper's nest. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. In that day, the root of Jesse will stand as a banner for the peoples. The nations will rally to him, and his resting place will be glorious. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thank you, Jeremy. What a beautiful passage. Listening to that poetic scene just painted for us in words, you almost would think Isaiah wrote them while sitting on a mountainside by a quiet stream, watching the birds in a peaceful sort of dreamlike state. But we know that this is not the world that Isaiah lived in. Isaiah most likely received this prophecy 740 years before Jesus's birth, while he was the official court prophet for King Ahaz, king of Judah. And Ahaz was a fairly incompetent king who often rebelled against God. So maybe we want to picture Isaiah as almost like a spiritual advisor to the 45th president of the United States, whose warnings, Isaiah's warnings were constantly ignored by Ahaz and others in power. Judah's leaders were breaking covenants. They were passing unjust laws. They were oppressing the poor and the widows and the orphans. And what's more, Isaiah was prophesying at the start of what's sometimes known as the first Holocaust of Jewish people, a 40-year span of brutal attacks by the kingdom of Assyria. And Assyria had just finished conquering and deporting their northern neighbors in Israel. And now Isaiah can already hear the hoofbeats of Assyria's horses encroaching on their territory, on Judah. And he knows that they're next. If you go back just one chapter to Isaiah 10, you see Isaiah describing the devastation awaiting Judah and later awaiting Assyria using ecological imagery from the forest, axes swinging, lopping off the tall branches of the trees, felling whole trees, and the remaining stumps being completely burned with fire until there's so few trees that even a child could count how many there were. The whole scene reminds me of when I was visiting my sister in Kamloops this summer after some of the forest fires, and it was just scorched, barren land under an orange, smoky sky. That's the picture of Isaiah 10. So it's right there in the middle of this climate of impending doom that Isaiah's prophetic vision takes a surprising turn in chapter 11. And he zooms in on one of these scorched, dead, clear-cut stumps and describes just a tiny green shoot sprouting up from it. Against all odds, he sees life breaking through death, drawing on a deeper magic through the roots that are still in the ground. And Isaiah calls this the shoot from the stump of Jesse. And that's our hint that this is not just any tree, but a family tree, the family tree of King David, whose father was named Jesse. This shoot represents a new king in the line of David. And this would make sense to Isaiah's audience because God had promised David that his descendants would hold the throne forever. So we know that Isaiah is about to describe a king who's hopefully better than King Ahaz, this hoped for king in the line of David. Now, when you want to describe a king in the ancient Near East, there were some norms. There were some stories and references that were consistently used to validate someone's power. So you would often see tales of the king's younger years that would involve daring and fearless encounters with predatory animals. You would hear of them wrestling bears or killing wolves, or even better, fighting a lion. And the logic goes that if a king can do that, you can trust him to protect his people from their enemies. And then the royal propaganda machine would further emphasize the king's weapons and the king's armor and all of his military conquests. Kingship was a violent business. Take a familiar example from that time. Take David and Goliath. So in 1 Samuel 17, when David was about to fight Goliath and prove himself to be king material, Saul was trying to talk him out of it because he thought David was going to be creamed by Goliath. But David said to Saul, "Listen, Saul, I'm a shepherd. And when a lion or a bear comes to try to steal my lamb from my flock, I go after it with a club and I rescue the lamb from its mouth. And if the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and I club it to death. And I've done this to both lions and bears, so I'll do it to Goliath too." And of course, as we all know, David went on to kill not only Goliath, but many other enemies of Israel. So much so that the women of Israel would sing, "Saul has killed his thousands, David his tens of thousands." So even with King David, who was arguably Israel's best and most godly king, it was violence against predatory animals and battlefield conquests that proved his kingly worth to his people. So maybe you can start to see why Isaiah's prophecy, which was written 200 years after David died, is so unexpected. The usual suspects are there. We saw wolves and leopards and bears and lions. That checks out, but there's no slaying. There's no conquering. Nothing for the history books. These animals are just peacefully coexisting, lying down together, chilling. They're not dispensable objects that prop up a king. Their own well-being as animals seems to matter to this king. Furthermore, there's no swords or spears even mentioned, no battlefield heroics in this passage. This king strikes and slays only with his mouth, with his words, his breath. There's no armor. Instead, he's clothed with a belt of righteousness and a sash of faithfulness. Now, that might remind you, some of you who grew up memorizing Bible verses from the New Testament, from Paul's armor of God passage in Ephesians. And I think Paul was definitely riffing off this passage. So instead of weapons and armor, this king uses words and breath and righteousness and faithfulness as tools for correcting the inequities that are inflicted on the poor and the needy. And instead of conquering enemy nations, he's drawing them in like a banner. He's inviting them to join this holy mountain, his glorious place of rest. And the life force of this king is the Spirit of God, who rests on him, who gives him wisdom and insight and discernment and valor and deeper and more reliable ways of knowing than any human senses could provide. And this empowers him to have this transformative, nonviolent kind of justice. He has everything he needs to set the world right and to reorder it in a radically new way. Now, you may have noticed there's a child that was present in that scene as well. And with our kind of Christian lenses, especially at Christmas time, we might be tempted to connect the child to the baby Jesus. That's a plausible interpretation because back in chapter 7, Isaiah had already talked about a child that will be born called Emmanuel, God with us. But to me, the child in this scene here doesn't seem to be the same person as the king. The child seems more like an example of a vulnerable person who's enjoying the environment of safety that the king has created. Somebody completely defenseless who's just hanging out with dangerous animals, even leading the animals around without any fear of being harmed. It's the epitome, the biggest example that Isaiah could give of the type of deep safety that was there. So just to sum up Isaiah's vision, we have a multinational, multi-species king, a non-violent, transformative justice kind of king, whose power doesn't seem to be forceful and top-down, but more of a gentle, beside and under kind of grassroots power. A king who breaks the mold of every other king that's gone before, including David. And that could be why Isaiah says the king is from the stump of Jesse, naming David's father without ever mentioning David himself. This is a radically new model. This is a King 2.0. And my sermon title today is King of Kin, not King of Kings, but King of Kin, because there's a profound sense of kinship, of relatedness here, a togetherness, a withness, non-human animals lying with and eating with and living with and playing with one another and also with human children. This is God with us. This is other creatures with us. This is us with us, other nations with us. And of course, there's also references to mountains and to seas, to plant life, to shoots and roots, and even straw and fruit. It's a whole ecosystem connected by these kinship bonds of peace without competition for resources. Gone is the threat of international violence, of interspecies violence, no predators, no fear, no suffering, no death. It's a vision of right relatedness with the Spirit of God and with all our created kin. To borrow a phrase from our guest preacher, Melanie, and other Indigenous people, this is all our relations, all my relations, a beautiful and blessed reordering of creation. Some might say it's a return to the Garden of Eden, a return to a time before humans sinned and brought suffering and pain to creation. But that's not actually how I see it. And let me be a theology science nerd for just 1 second here, because I've been geeking out over this lately. I think that there was suffering and pain in the animal kingdom long before humans evolved. I believe that God gave freedom for evolution to happen over thousands and millions of years, a process that actually came with pain and suffering, predator-prey relationships, competition for resources that pushed species to specialize. And in the words of one scientist, Holmes Rolston III, the cougar's fangs carved the fleet-footed deer, and the deer carved the cougar's fangs. Evolution was this package deal where there was a beautiful variety of species, but it came with aggression and predation and suffering and fear and a lot of violence and death. But I believe God's been working behind the scenes, present to the suffering of all creatures, making meaning out of their pain and redeeming creation, waiting for these creatures to desire more than just safety or food or progeny or control, but also to develop more selfless desires for the good of the other. God has been patiently awaiting creation's developing capacity to love God back and to love one another. So I see this new creation, this kingdom of peace, not as some return to this perfect time, but as a forward movement towards something ever more complex and beautiful. Perhaps even a world where both human and non-human animals will develop an awakened capacity to love God back. Okay, apologies if I lost anybody with all of that speculative evolutionary theology nerdery. I'm going to get back to talking about Isaiah's prophecy and how it connects to Jesus and to this Advent Sunday of joy. This mysterious king of kin, as I call him, that was prophesied in this part of Isaiah pops up in different forms throughout the whole book of Isaiah. As I mentioned in chapter 7, he's a child born to a young woman called Emmanuel, Wonderful Counselor, Prince of Peace. And in the second half of the book, which was likely written much later at a different time of exile, the Babylonian exile by disciples of Isaiah, the king of kin is recast as the suffering servant, somebody whose practice of nonviolence and radical love would mean a refusal to retaliate when rejected and killed. Now we hear those things and immediately we think, that's Jesus, it's got to be Jesus. But I doubt that Isaiah imagined anything quite so unexpected as the incarnation of God in human form. I think Isaiah was just imagining a very mortal king, blessed by God's Spirit, who would make Israel great again, who would use this image of animals and this hyperbolic piece to describe what it would be like to have a reign of somebody without fear, an all-powerful king. So I also think that while Jesus walked the earth, his friends weren't looking at him and going, oh yeah, he's definitely the Isaiah 11 guy. But after witnessing Jesus's death and resurrection, I understand why they looked back and connected these passages in Isaiah to Jesus. Jesus, who was born among sheep and cattle and donkeys and goats and placed in a feeding trough. Jesus, who began his ministry with a dove landing on him, the Spirit of God resting on him, leading him into the wilderness to live for 40 days with the wild beasts and return unharmed, as Reverend Dr. Vicky Marie pointed out to us. Jesus, who told stories about sparrows being precious to God, who welcomed little children to feel safe with him and blessed them. Jesus, who somehow rode an unbroken donkey into Jerusalem, who compared himself to a hen longing to gather her chicks under her wings. And Jesus, who died at least in part to end a sacrificial system that depended on the ritual slaughter of animals. I do believe that Jesus is the king of kin, the king of creation, the king of human and non-human animals, and that Jesus's death and resurrection unleashed the power of new reordered kinship relationships. But Jesus hasn't yet completely fulfilled the vision that Isaiah described. He conquered death, he left his spirit, he promised to return. But meanwhile, the world that we live in is perhaps not so different from Isaiah's. Greed and abuse and oppression and violence and injustice are still rampant. There are wars, climate emergencies, environmental devastation. I mean, just during the course of this 3 months of our sermon series, we've seen a UN climate conference end with disappointing results. We've seen brutal RCMP attacks on Indigenous land defenders, and not to mention the flooding and the landslides. We are in this season between the coming of the King of Kin and his return. And we're still waiting for his nonviolent kingdom to fully come. And yet I think we have advantages over Isaiah because we've seen a taste, we've seen a glimpse of this kingdom in the life of Jesus. And we've received the same Spirit that filled and empowered Jesus. And that Spirit speaks deep within us and reminds us that ever since Jesus was written into our story and conquered death, it means there will come a time when all is well. That no matter what kind of destruction we cause, the King of Kin is present with us, suffering with us, working to bring meaning and good and renewal, calling us to remember all our relations and join his healing work. There's a theologian and environmentalist named Wendell Berry, a self-described mad farmer, and he wrote, "Be joyful though you have considered all the facts." Be joyful even though you've considered all the facts. I don't think this is a a mere happiness. I think if happiness is a field of flowers that come and go with the seasons, joy is like the whole ecosystem that surrounds it and supports it through change. Joy is both the trust that you know where everything is headed and the surprise and uncertainty in how you're going to get there. It's openness to being surprised by unexpected turns, just the way Isaiah's vision was unexpected and the way Jesus showed up was unexpected. It's knowing that you're not in control of the end, but it's trusting that it will be good. It's keeping our eyes open for a God who can do impossible things. Take a dead, burned out stump and make it into a nurse log for a burst of new life. Take an unknown but willing woman and make her the mother of God. Could take a little church like ours and watch it grow instead of decline during COVID. Could even take, the loaf pans that some of us have for Advent, which 2 weeks ago had no signs of life and now are growing these huge pea shoots and ryegrass. As we close this series on climate justice, it's tempting for me to try to wrestle some practical application into this sermon, like 10 simple steps to saving the planet. But this piece of scripture resists calls to action. This scripture only asks that we trust in the coming King of Kin, asks us to take joy and delight in anticipating his coming. It's more about what the Spirit of God will accomplish than about us. Of course, in our joy, in our delight, we might just find ourselves so captivated by this King of Kin that we want to start living in his new kingdom, in this new economy right now. And it might begin to shift how we see and treat non-human animals or forests or mountains or people from other nations. Some of that future peaceable realm might start coming back and coloring our present. The book of Hebrews says, Jesus endured the cross for the joy set before him. And I think our best actions for climate are motivated not by guilt, not by shame or fear, but by joy. And I see some of you in Show and Tell describing your actions, and I see that joy. I think there's joy in Patricia's embrace of veganism, and joy in Jeremy's bike rides, and in the electric bike travels of Carrie Ann and the Kifts. Joy in the Sportax embrace of bread machine bread, and in Cricket's foraging. As weird as it sounds, there was even joy in my arrest last month at the TMX expansion site. As I sat watching a hawk circle above me and a little wren hop around me as the injunction was being read to me. For the joy set before us, we practice living on that holy mountain of kinship, the glorious place of rest where none can harm or destroy. We follow our King of Kin, not with an austere or gloomy puritanical rule following, not with shame or fear, not with a fake Pollyanna kind of optimism, not with a white-knuckled trying to control things, or with a smug certainty. But we follow with hard-won hope, defiant joy, despite having considered all the facts, and an eye for those little shoots sprouting impossibly from stumps, just the way that shoot is sprouting from the avocado. Because we know that until all is well, and all manner of thing as well, the story is not over. And even that glorious resting place will not be the end of the story, not really. It will just be the start of the next chapter of life in the kingdom of the good King. Amen.